Today is 29th of September 2011. The time is 5:26 p.m. We are at the Dorchester Hotel in Mayfair, London. I am Yap Wan Ho, interviewing on behalf of Ming Ai Institute for the British Chinese Food Culture Project. And today I'm interviewing Mr. Ken Hom, OBE. Would you mind spelling out your name for the purpose of the archive, please?
Yes. My official name is Kenneth Jung Hom, which in Cantonese is Tam Wing Fai.
Would you mind spelling your full name?
Yes. The full name is Kenneth Jung, Jung, Hom, Hom.
Thank you. Could you tell us why and how did you enter the catering industry, please?
It's a very long story, but I began in my uncle's restaurant when I was 11 years old, working in Chicago, Chinatown, in America. And it was a very popular, big restaurant, and that's where I learned how to cook.
So what was your first dish, do you remember?
Yes, my first dish that I ever did was actually fried rice. It's because one of the cooks was taking a nap, and the order was for fried rice, and they said, can you do it? And so I did it.
Excellent. And what was the inspiration for you to start teaching cooking in Berkeley?
I think the inspiration to start teaching cooking was a way of sharing my Chinese culture with people who actually was interested in Chinese food, but they didn't really understand it. And I think it's not just merely cooking Chinese dishes, but there's a whole history and culture behind it. And I thought teaching was a fantastic way to actually show my culture through its food.
Yeah. And how did you market yourself in the lessons then?
Well, I first began by forming a cooking school, and people could come and spend an evening where I show them how to cook, and then I actually cook for them. And then later on, I was hired by the Culinary Academy in San Francisco to actually teach professional chefs. And when I started doing that, I was able to put together a curriculum for 1 week, showing them Chinese food, not only of different regions, but about how Chinese food had evolved. In other words, why we stir fry, why we steam, what was the historical roots behind it.
Right. And so what kind of regional cuisines were you teaching at the time?
I thought it was very important for them to know all the regions of China. Of course, I'm Cantonese, so I was biased. I thought the South was always the best. But I also wanted to show them, of course, in the North, Beijing and Peking duck, etc. Sichuan, which from the West, and of course the cooking of the East, which is in Fujian, near Shanghai and those areas.
It's very impressive, quite a range. And who helped you publish your first cookbook that became one of the turning points in your career?
I was asked when I was teaching in this late 70s. Actually, a French chef said, "You should actually do for Chinese cooking what I did for French cooking, and that is to show Chinese cooking techniques." And his name was Jacques Pepin, and he inspired me to do my first book with a major New York publisher, Simon Schuster. And at that time, there was not too many Chinese cookbooks being published.
And do you have some interesting stories of when you first presented cookery TV series on the BBC?
Yes, when I first presented the BBC cookery series, I was really terrified, because I had been on television, but I have never done sort of that type of television presenting. And I find it quite annoying because I had to remember every precise portion of 1 teaspoon, 2 teaspoon, and I've never cooked like that. So it drove me absolutely mad.
And there were different measurements to the US as well.
Yes, there were not only different, but the thing is, I never really measured, so I don't cook that way, and it was quite frightening for me to remember things, and I was just terrified about my thought process because in television presenting, it has to be very logical. You have to say this, and then this follows that, and I had a tendency to ramble.
We'll try to let you ramble as much as you like today. How would you compare your first experience of cooking on the BBC compared with the later TV shoots?
Well, I think it took me a long time after my first television series, which was in the early 80s. I was actually quite traumatized, and it took me almost 8 years before I could do another series. And by that time, I had more experience, which is what I needed. I was used to not only being in front of the camera, but I made many public appearances in the UK, so I was much more at ease. I think when I did my first series, people didn't really know me in this country, and so and I didn't know them, and so I didn't have sort of a reference, a point on which to address people and to be at ease. And by the time I did my second series, which was equally successful as my first series, I got a whole new generation of young people interested in Chinese cooking.
That's great work. Do you remember what was the general Chinese food like when you first visited the UK?
When I first visited the UK in 1971, I think, like all food in this country, it was pretty dreadful. Chinese cooking was mainly chop suey, which I knew. I didn't know where that came from. It did not come from China. It was abysmal, and only if you spoke Chinese you could get something decent. There were not a lot of ingredients. I remember cooking for friends who were kind enough to lodge me in London. I'm trying to cook them a Chinese meal, and I could barely find ginger, fresh vegetables. It was very, very poor, as it was in the supermarkets for British people.
So you mentioned chop suey earlier. What do you think of it?
Well, I think chop suey was something we served to other people, not to us.
Did you find it easy to find ingredients for chop suey?
Well, I think chop suey is sort of, anything that's left over.
So thinking back to now, how has Chinese food changed in the UK?
Well, I think Chinese food in the UK has progressed like all food in the UK. It's like night and day. I think you can get incredibly good Chinese food, and that's because of all the Hong Kong Chinese that have come to this country. The Chinese that have come here are more demanding, and a lot of Chinese travel from Hong Kong, and I think they insist on something that they would get in Hong Kong. And the quality of Chinese food has generally gone up exponentially as food in the UK in general. I think it's followed the general trend of food in the UK.
And how do you think the identity of Chinese food has changed?
Well, I think Chinese food identity has changed simply because people have traveled to China, and China has opened up. Since the 1970s, people's awareness of Chinese food has increased immensely. And the thing is, if you think that 3-4 years ago, Chinese food has overtaken Indian food as sort of the favorite ethnic food in this country, also shows you the trend toward lighter food that is not so heavy. We know that Chinese food is good for us. 1.3 3 billion people can't be wrong. And I think just awareness of travelers, opening up of China has made people aware of what's going on.
See, so what? Because you've had quite a big campaign to make to improve the image of Chinese food and promoting it as a healthy food. What do you think were the challenges to counter the stereotype of Chinese food being quite unhealthy, deep fried dishes?
This is one of my biggest beef. When people who are not Chinese order Chinese food, they order everything fried. I mean, you would never see Chinese doing that. You might have one dish fried, one dish steamed, one dish stir-fried, one dish braised, but you would never have everything fried. And I think it's the British tendency, how they love their fish and chips. They want their fish and chips, and well, thank God now Chinese restaurants are not serving chips anymore with Chinese food. But I remember in 1971 they were serving chips, which I thought was so odd. Because number one, Chinese don't eat a lot of potatoes in general, let alone fried. And I think the biggest challenge is getting the British public to see Chinese food as it really is, not as a stereotype of everything fried in oil. Now, Chinese restaurants serve it because that's what the public wants. I think when I do something like a steamed fish for people, they can't believe it. It's such a wonderful thing, especially when the fish is fresh, rather than put in batter and fried.
Where do you think the deep fried trend came from? Deep fried Chinese food?
Well, the deep fried trend in Chinese food has come from the British love of anything fried. They love fried things because it's fat, it's crispy. Crispy is the golden word for any dish, whether Chinese or not. If you say it's crispy, people will buy it. So they like it crunchy and crispy, and of course it's oily. It feels good in the mouth, but of course, if you eat food like that all the time, it's not healthy.
So what did you find effective to educate the general public on cooking and eating more healthy Chinese food?
Well, I think to educate the general public on eating good Chinese food is to show them how, number one, how easy it is to make it, how quick it's easy, how colorful it could be. I think I'm very proud when people say to me that my husband or children never ate vegetables until I stir-fried them. And I think it's something I grew up with. I love vegetables. I mean, my mother used to just do a simple stir-fry of Chinese choy sum with garlic and salt. That was it. It was I could have eaten just that. And how many sort of British children would eat that? It's because they never had to cook like that nicely. It's like Italians will cook. They have spinach stir-fried in olive oil with garlic. It's the same sort of thing.
That's interesting. You mentioned about Italian food because in some ways they're quite similar, but yet it's quite different.
Right. I think of all the cuisines, the most similar to especially Cantonese food is Italian, simply because it's lighter, it's very fresh. It's a very simple cuisine that relies solely on the ingredients. If the ingredients are not good, you can't make Italian food. And the same thing with Cantonese. You can't make good Cantonese food without good ingredients.
Yeah, I had an Italian housemate, and I found out the cooking technique is quite similar. The bigger difference being that Chinese cooking is high heat, and Italian does everything lower heat.
That's right. The difference between Italian and Chinese is because Italians use olive oil, and you cannot use high heat for olive oil because you destroy it. And so that's probably the only major difference. But then the Italians got the pasta from us, so we're we're bonded in history.
That's right. So, did you find having DVDs an effective tool to help people to understand how easy it is to cook and for you to demonstrate cooking techniques?
Well, I think certainly modern technology has helped people learn how to cook. For instance, Chinese stir frying. Having things like DVD is very, very helpful, because when somebody sees something, they say, "Oh, I understand that. I can do it." And I found, for instance, making public appearances, doing sort of a physical demonstration, people are astonished how actually what it means to stir fry in a wok.
So when you were cooking for the head of state, were you cooking in front of them as well?
No. When I cook for the head of states, you stay in the back because they're also busy trying to network and do business. The cooks should stay in the back. Just give us the food.
So you weren't able to pass on the wisdom of Chinese cooking to them then? And how do you feel the British public has responded to your cooking programs and books throughout the years?
Well, I think the British public has been quite enthusiastic about Chinese cooking. It was a huge success when it first came out, and it's endured all these years. It's interesting. My friend just gave me a statistic that said at least 19% of the British public has cooked one of my recipes, and 87% of the British public actually sort of know my name or somehow associate me with Chinese cooking. So that means the awareness impact is quite great.
I can vouch that 100% of my friends that I've mentioned knew who you were. How do you feel about the label British Chinese food?
How
do you feel about the label of British Chinese food?
Well, I think British Chinese food is evolving into just Chinese food in general. I think it used to be more British. What I mean by that is when it had chips at takeaway shops, that is very British. But it's becoming more and more authentic and more Chinese, because the British public has moved on. They become more sophisticated, they travel, they're exposed to things, they watch television, they read books, they eat in good Chinese restaurant, and a lot of Brits have become very sophisticated about Chinese food now.
And you have also done a lot of traveling yourself.
Yes.
To taste local food. What is the most inspiring trip you had in regards to cooking?
Well, I think many of the trips I take have informed my cooking. And what I mean by that is I travel a lot because it's one of the best ways for me to learn about food everywhere. It's funny, I think the most memorable trip I did was when I went to China for over 3 months, traveling and eating actually 1,500 dishes, of which none of whom I knew existed. And that was a real revelation to me. It showed me how little I actually knew about Chinese cooking, and especially in areas of China which I only scratched the surface of. And it showed me how profound and deep the cuisine was, and how ancient it was.
And has that influenced your own cooking in return?
Oh yes, it's influenced me a lot in cooking, made me more humble.
And how would you compare Chinese food in different countries?
Oh, that's interesting. Chinese food in different countries are they're adapted to, of course, the country. Like for instance, Chinese food in America tends to have a portion size 3 times what a Chinese would eat, because Americans want big portions. In France, for example, Chinese food tend to have a Vietnamese or Cambodian tinge to it, which is kind of strange. While in Holland, Chinese food tends to be more sort of Indonesian based, and they seem to throw curry in a lot of Chinese dishes, which is interesting.
With chips?
Yeah, no, thankfully without chips.
And you've been working in many different countries as well. What's worldwide?
Well, I've worked in many different countries, and it's interesting to see how the Chinese have adapted to wherever they are. In other words, I think if you go to a place like Sweden or Finland, they would do stir-fry reindeer, which you don't, because people eat reindeer in those countries. I think the Chinese catering industry is very adaptable. We're very flexible, and we take things that were not Chinese, like asparagus, and made it into a Chinese dish very easily.
So, what do you think is the prospect of Chinese food worldwide?
Well, I think the prospects of Chinese food is very, very bright. As China now has emerged to take its rightful place in the world, I'm so proud to see Chinese food will definitely follow.
Yeah, and as an ambassador of Chinese food, how would you promote it?
I would promote Chinese food by continuing to show people how to cook it, how to do it authentically and right. But Chinese food and cuisine is not dogmatic. It's all about our techniques. We don't. It's not codified the way French cooking in the West has been. It's much more adaptable and flexible, and that is the great strength of Chinese food. You can adapt it to any place in the world.
It's a great prospect indeed. So, going back to the things that you have established, what was the inspiration for establishing your own cooking range and noodles and sauces?
Well, I think over the years I always wanted to do things so that people can actually stir fry the way I have shown them. And one of the ways to do that was to give them a wok they can use. And the problem is the wok originally, the idea is for a Chinese hob and Chinese fire, which doesn't exist in this country. So I modified the wok so that we can still have the principle of high heat, and you can still stir fry and get the results. And that was the inspiration for my cookware. And for things like ready-cooked meals and sauces, when people ask me, can you create something that is authentic, that has an authentic taste? Well, that's a good challenge. So that inspired me to work with different companies to create authentic sauces.
And how do you feel that your range has developed over the years?
I think my range has developed over the years by constantly tweaking things. In fact, I noticed something in this country that the palate is spicier now, and people love spicy food. And British people like food with flavor, and so I tend to add the amounts of ginger and garlic that the Chinese would use.
And more recently, what was the inspiration for your green wok range?
The inspiration for my green wok range was also to address people's concern about the environment. I think one cannot live in a bubble. I think we've become conscious of ecology and what we're doing, and these are things I believe in. I'm part of that. Like, for instance, I think a good example of that thinking is, for instance, shark fins. I know that shark fins are very controversial and Chinese, but I believe that we don't need to eat shark fins, simply because when you see how the sharks are treated, their fins are cut and then thrown back into the sea live, and so they die. It's such a waste, and it doesn't follow the right ethics of how we should be. And I think as Chinese culture it's about ethics as well.
I think that's a great step to be aware of, for sure. I'm very pleased with it. And your official website says that 1 in 8 Britain own a can home wok. How did you achieve this?
1 in 8 households in the UK own a can home wok. I think I achieved that simply because of longevity. I've been around a long time. So we saturated the country. So by 30 years, I mean, each household would have at least one can home wok. But I think it's also the public awareness of what I do, and that it's good, healthy cooking, and it's also very much part of today's lifestyle, stir-frying in a wok.
Well, you've made a great contribution to Chinese food in Britain. Which role in the catering business do you enjoy the most? As a chef, a tutor, writer, consultant, and your own brand, among other things, in charity as well?
Well, I think of all the roles that I play, having my own cookware, being consultant, TV presenter, etc. I think the thing that is the most satisfying for me is my work on behalf of charities. I tell you why, because I think it's the way my mum brought me up, is that when you are doing well and successful, it's important for you to give back to society. And it's all part of that karma, which I sincerely believe in.
On behalf of Ming Ai and charity, we thank you for that. Another tricky question for you. You've had a really remarkable career. What would you say you're most proud of?
Yes, I believe I've had a remarkable career, but I think the thing I'm most proud of is my mother's pride. She grew up, it was very difficult for her because she was a single parent. My father died when I was very young. And being Chinese, I really felt that it was important to make her proud. And until she passed away recently, I knew she had a quiet pride, and that made me very happy.
Good. We hope more young boys are watching this and make their mothers proud as well. So what other further challenges lay ahead for you?
Well, I think the challenges that lay ahead for me are to continue what I do, to keep the public's interest in what I do. I think I want the public to feel that I am not just passing fad, and that the Chinese cuisine is as long as our culture, thousands of years, and we have a lot to give to the world. And as Chinese say, we have a lot to learn from the world, but the world can learn some things from us. And if we can contribute to that by showing our cuisine, that'd be fantastic.
I can see that you'll be keeping yourself quite busy in the near future then. How do you feel about dealing with food as your career? How do you feel about dealing with food as a career?
Well, I feel that food, especially today, is an incredible career opportunity. I do a lot of work with Oxford Brookes University in their Department of Hospitality and Food and Tourism. And I think food has such a bright future. Even in times of recession, the one area that holds up has been food. And so the prospects are very bright for people who are interested in getting into this business.
So speaking of Oxford Brookes Library, what can be found in there apart from your cookbook?
Yes, in Oxford Brookes you have my collection of not only cookery books, but books about things that I'm very interested in. For instance, I have many books about China, books about Hong Kong, books about Asian Americans, I have books about Chinese Britons. It's about, I think, a whole culture, not just about food, because our food is all about us too.
That's true. And do you know the late Mr. Ken Lo?
Yes, I knew Ken Lo. He was quite a gentleman. I have to tell you a very funny story, because our names were so similar that people often confused us. And when Ken Lo passed away, there were some people that called my producer and we said, "We're sorry about your presenter." And they thought or what was very funny is that often people come up to me and said, "I've been to your restaurant," meaning Ken Lo's restaurant, and if that was true, I would be 140.
Congratulations. Do you have any other funny stories you could share with us?
Well, there's many funny stories.
From your career.
But I think it's... I mean, at the beginning, I used to have to correct people when they thought I was Ken Lo. And because we were so... I think... implanted in people's mind about Chinese cooking, because he was the first one, and because there's so much similarity between our names, and people get confused. So I stopped doing that now. What I do is I said, "Well, thank you for coming to my restaurant," even though I have no profits from it. It makes life simpler.
Well, at least you were promoting similar message of Chinese food,
right?
And not something too drastic.
We're working on the same side anyway.
Exactly. Could be worse.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to add or share with us?
Can't think of it at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you very much
for
your time.
It's a great pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you very much
for
your time.
It's a great pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you very much
for your
time.